Jennifer Ghent-Fuller was a nurse in Canada for over 25 years, the last 11 as an educator and support counselor for people with dementia, their families, and other carers. Jennifer has a Bachelor of Arts from Queen's University, a Bachelor of Nursing from the University of British Columbia, and a Master's of Science in Nursing from the University of Western Ontario. That's a lot of education. Jennifer has also worked as a volunteer in the fields of literacy and elder abuse prevention. Since her retirement from nursing, she is enjoying her new career as a writer. Thoughtful Dementia Care is her first book. It's selling far faster than she thought it might. Jennifer has long been the go-to person when you need creative and compassion ideas for helping those with responsive behaviors. An industrious and inspired writer, we are sure there will be many books added to this one in the coming years. Jennifer lives in Waterloo, where she's an active member of 2 Probus clubs, and she's enjoying caring for her granddaughters after school. As well, she is becoming involved in a planning committee in the city of Waterloo. So as everybody else who might be retired, you realize that retirement is that new career. It's just that you do it with a happy, smiley face. So I welcome Jennifer.
Thank you very much, Diane. I met Lee and Michael at their first Elder Abuse Committee meeting when they moved to Kitchener many years ago, 19 or 20 years ago. I did talks on elder abuse as a volunteer for 10 years with that group, and I am certain that that experience has shaped my approach to understanding people with dementia. What does the term thoughtful dementia care mean? Thoughtful dementia care means taking what you know about a person's losses in memory, their losses and abilities, and trying to figure out what the understanding of a situation is to the person with dementia, given all of their losses in ability and knowledge, and then design the care from there. What is their experience? Understanding the actual experience of having dementia. So for example, what do we use our short-term memory for? How does the loss of short-term memory affect people's functioning and their thinking? How does having gaps in our long-term memory affect our understanding of the world? And how does it relate to how we act, how we understand our circumstances, or the emotions that we feel? So being thoughtful means trying our very best to puzzle out how the person with dementia understands their current situation, and also trying our best to understand whether our reactions are making the situation worse or better. Now, we can't ever fully understand what another person's experience is, but we can try to come as close as possible in order to help the person with dementia manage their day-to-day trials. We can orient ourselves to their reality. It's very important, I feel, to put a strong emphasis on how difficult it is to have dementia, and then the need to be thoughtful in caring for someone with dementia follows very easily. This approach will help those who are sharing their lives understand how people with dementia are acting, what they might be thinking in many circumstances throughout the day. And this will also help carers understand how best to interact with people with dementia, how to help them in their daily life, and to prevent them from becoming afraid. Now, when I'm speaking today, I'm looking mainly at the pattern of changes in those with Alzheimer's disease. I'm certainly going to comment on other diseases that cause progressive dementia. I want to remind you, and you're probably well aware of this, all the changes that take place in Alzheimer's disease also take place in people who have dementia, progressive dementia due to other diseases, but mainly in a different order. And so as the disease becomes more global, people look more similar. So it mainly impacts the care in their early stage. So I'd like to look first at the changes in memory processes and how they impact on everyday life for a person with dementia. Now, we think of memory as being one entity. We either have a good memory or we have a bad memory. In fact, we have many different types of memory, many different memory processes. And these are affected at different times when people develop dementia. And this leads to unusual thought patterns. We're used to all of our types of memories working consistently and coordinating with each other. But what you have is that some types of memories aren't there and others are very strong, and so you see quite a different thought pattern in people with dementia. For our short-term memory, we use this to remember approximately the last week or so and what's coming up in the next couple of days. So for example, today's Thursday. If you tried to remember what happened on Monday, you could probably do it. It might take you a minute to pull it back up. But if you tried to remember some random Monday 6 months ago, you probably wouldn't get any information from it at all. It's not in your long-term memory. So the short-term memory covers the last few days and what's coming up in the next couple of days. So we use our short-term memory to carry on normal conversation. And one of the big changes is that people with a short-term memory loss, right at the very beginning, are unable to track a conversation over days or over hours. And since this is usually the first symptom of Alzheimer's disease, this means the normal household conversation is disrupted very early. Most of the conversations, if you just think about what you're talking about with someone later on today, more than likely it's based on your short-term memory, what you're just doing today, what you're going to be doing tomorrow. And so it's relatively rare to talk about what happened many, many years ago. So for example, say you have a health problem that's being investigated and you want to talk it over with the people that you live with and the people in your family. If you're talking to somebody with short-term memory loss, you have to reintroduce it and talk about it right from scratch every single time that you do it. So conversation moves away, conversation in a household moves away from goal-directed problem solving, that you help each other figure out the problems of day-to-day issues, to conversation that's mainly therapeutic for the person with dementia. But this leaves their family member feeling lonely without someone to share the day-to-day things that are going on with them. And it initiates the grieving process. So this is right at the very beginning of Alzheimer's disease and other diseases causing dementia. One lady said to me, you know, my husband, and this was actually the day he was diagnosed and he was very early in his dementia. She said, he's sitting right there in the chair beside me and I miss him. So it has a huge impact. When people have a short-term memory loss, the thoughts that they have are mainly about their remote past. So with most of the current content of our thoughts being about current events of the day and week, they don't have access to that. And so what do they think about? They think about what they have access to, and what they have access to is the past. Many family members will complain, well, they only talk about the past, you know, because they want to talk about current events, not understanding what the implications of a short-term memory loss are. Sometimes they say they can't visit when their loved one goes into the nursing home because they can't talk to them. So it's very important to remember that the only information that a person with short-term memory loss has is the past, and conversations that are held in the past, especially about their past, are extremely successful and they can have wonderful visits. When people experience short-term memory loss, they become unable to perform complicated tasks or multitask, so doing more than one thing at a time. So for example, if you're cooking a meal, you might have 4 or 5 different types of foods on the go at the same time. You've got something in the oven, you're making a salad, you've got a couple of things on the stove, and you're talking at the same time. So you're doing a lot of things at once. And so when people develop short-term memory loss, they're only really able to keep one thing in their mind at a time. And so this ability to perform these complex tasks and to multitask disappears very early. People with short-term memory loss also experience being very easily distracted. They keep only one thing in their mind. There was an example of one lady who had just made a lovely meal for her husband, and they were sitting and enjoying it, and she just happened to comment, "Oh, you know, that side garden's looking terrible. It really needs weeding." And in a split second, he was up and he was out the door, and she followed him out the door, and she said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "Well, I'm weeding the garden." And she said, "Well, why don't you finish your lunch?" And he said, "Oh, were we eating?" So that's a really clear example of someone who can only keep one thing in their mind at a time. So, of course, when she came for advice, she was very astonished and disturbed at the fact that he would just get up and leave the table. But once she understood what the implications of his short-term memory loss were, she became thoughtful, trying not to throw him off, trying not to confuse him. So being thoughtful means giving a person the best chance at being able to perform. Another family thought that their mother could no longer cook, and she said, "Oh yes, I can make a meal, no problem." They wanted to get her help. They wanted to have meal replacements for her. And so they asked me what I thought, and I said, "Well, now, when you go to assess whether or not your mom can cook, what are you doing?" "Oh, well, we're standing in the kitchen talking to her." And I said, "Well, you know what? That's not a fair assessment, because you're asking her to do two things at the same time. So it's very important. Next time you go and see if she can cook, step outside and just tell her, you know, call us if you need any help." And of course, she did quite well with that. So giving people the best opportunity to perform, it's understanding what memory processes they need when they're doing something. People with short-term memory loss experience living in the moment. And so when they're not remembering what's just happened and when they're not remembering what's about to happen, they get surprised when things happen. Somebody may have told them, it might be written on their calendar, but they've forgotten since they last read their calendar. And I don't know about you, but I'm not really fond of people dropping by unannounced into my house. I like to know. So think about the experience of somebody with short-term memory loss. Everybody's always dropping in because they're not expecting to see them. So then they're startled, they feel agitated. And this is especially so if somebody says to them, "Well, why aren't you ready?" You know, so you get scolded for not remembering so there's a lack of understanding there. Or, "Why didn't you stay at the table? I brought you to the table for lunch, you should still be sitting there." Well, that information disappears almost immediately for people with short-term memory loss. People with short-term memory loss also experience their learning being affected. So the short-term memory is used to hold information and practice it before it's transferred to the long-term care, or long-term memory. This is one of the ways that we put memories in our long-term memory, not the only one. But it's the difference if you, for example, are learning somebody's new phone number. You're using your short-term memory because you practice it, you write it down, you try it, you make mistakes, and finally it's in your long-term memory. And if you use it enough, it'll stay there. Compare that to somebody saying, "Oh, so-and-so in the family is going to have a new baby." You don't have to practice that. That's a different way into the long-term memory. You know it right away, and you always know it. So these are different memory processes. Once the short-term memory is affected, this type of memory, practicing things to put them in the long-term memory, is not reliable. And so people are unable to adapt to change in the family. So for example, one family, they got a new television, and Mom enjoyed her shows, but she could not learn how to use the remote control. And every time she wanted to watch a show, she'd pick up the remote control and hand it to them and say, "I'd like to watch such and such." And they said to her, "But we've showed you time and time again how to use this remote control. Why can't?" And you know, she lived in a big family, and they all said it to her. And so actually, when they were helped to understand why she couldn't use that remote control, that her short-term memory would not allow her how to do it. There were a lot of tears in the room because they felt very badly about how they've treated her. But, you know, I always say to people, life is too short to feel guilty. Once you know something, then you carry on from there. And because this is a very, very complex situation to help somebody through. So people who do not know what the implications of short-term memory loss are for the person with dementia are very prone to scolding and being impatient. Once they know that there's a diagnosis of dementia, it's very hard on the person with dementia and hard on themselves if they continue with this kind of approach. So it's very important to try to get as much understanding of the person's experience as possible, to understand what's going on with their memory, and to make every attempt to be patient. This is one of the most difficult situations to be in, caring for someone with dementia, but it's very important to make that attempt to be patient as possible. So it's important to look at the implications of the memory loss that that person has, and to be aware of what type of memory are you asking them to use when you talk to them. There was one lady who said to me, you know, my husband, he loves his day program, and he comes home and he's whistling and he's singing and he's having a great old time, but within 2 minutes of coming in the house, he's just a grumpy Gus. He just, you know, I can't say anything to him, he's really upset. And so I said to her, now tell me about your conversation when he comes home. And she says, well, I just ask him what he did. And so I helped her understand that when she was asking him what he did, he realized that he couldn't remember a thing. He was in a great mood from the morning, but he had no idea what he had done. And so this made him very sad and very upset, and she was tweaking that memory. So it's important to know which memory you're asking people to use. Now I'd like to look at the experience of long-term memory loss. So the pattern for Alzheimer's disease is called progressive retrograde amnesia. And so what happens is that we lay down memories as we go through life. When somebody develops Alzheimer's disease, they're slowly erased, but from the present back into the past. So that's the retrograde, going backwards in time. Progressive means more and more memory is being erased. And amnesia, of course, is memory loss. So people, when they've had Alzheimer's disease, say they were 81 when they developed Alzheimer's disease, by the time they're 83 or 84, they may only really remember the first 60 or 70 years of their life well, and the later, 24, 25 years, they have very spotty memories, if any. And as the memory loss progresses, they remember less and less. They remember their first 40 years, their first 30 years, their first 20 years, and that kind of thing. So with the short-term memory loss, people are living in the moment. When you add in the long-term memory loss, the context of that moment might be in the remote past. So they're using the context of their own past. So if someone is 81, but they really only remember the first 40 years of their life, they're trying to find the people that they knew and the places that they knew when they were 40 years old. That's their context. So for example, there was one woman who went from her house across the street and down one house and demanded to inspect that house. And her family was very embarrassed, and the people in that house were very annoyed. And but this didn't stop. This was happening, a couple of times a day. But once the family understood the process of long-term memory loss, and they related it to her past, they realized that 30 or 40 years ago, in a different city, on a different street, they had owned the house across the street and one down. And so once the family understood that, they were able to explain it to the neighbor, who no longer got upset, instead would give her a cup of tea if she could, and then call her and say, your mom's here again, just to inspect the house. And so you can see how that understanding, it really shapes the care. and it shapes the atmosphere that a person with dementia is living in. So when people are looking through the context of their past, they also mistake the identity of family members. They know that they have those relatives, but they expect them to look the way they did decades ago. So, you know, Sam might be looking for a brother who is 24 instead of his actual brother who is 84. He knows he has a brother, Sam, but he doesn't look anything like the fellow who says he's his brother. They, of course, then forget the incidents that people have passed away, and they go looking for their relatives who have passed away, their mom and dad who have passed away, and won't believe that they're no longer there because they have no memory of that death, and they have no memory of that funeral. They're looking for their former homes. They don't feel quite at home where they are. It's not familiar. The familiar house is the one that they used to live in the past. And they may not even recognize themselves in a mirror. So when somebody goes and stands in front of a mirror and they expect to see a 24-year-old and there's a 76-year-old looking at them, they won't maybe know who that is. Now, the memory loss isn't only for people and places, of course, it's also for things. And so the ordinary things that you build up a whole raft of memories of what's in your surroundings from the time that you're a child. What is a door? What is a chair? What is the floor? What is a mirror? So when somebody has forgotten what a mirror is and what it does, and then they're standing in front of it and they see a stranger, they often will talk about the strangers that are in their house. And this can cause a lot of confusion for them. You know, they might hold up a fork, for example, and say, well, I don't know what that is, and I don't know why anybody would think I would want it. Or if a telephone is ringing, they may not recognize that sound. And so, you know, where you and I might just ignore something like that or just go answer the phone, think about how you react when there's a really unusual sound. You've never heard it before, maybe it's loud. You get up, you run outside and say, what on earth was that? And so you have people with dementia who hear ordinary sounds. Nobody else in the room knows anything's the matter. But they're inside saying, oh my goodness, is everything okay? What's going on here? What is that sound? It could be the water running. It could be a vacuum cleaner, you know, almost anything. And so when people don't remember those kinds of things, it makes them agitated. So this leads to the phenomenon where people can experience being able to remember what happened 50 years ago, but not be able to remember what happened 5 minutes ago. They've lost the consistency in their memory. And so this makes other people who don't understand these processes think, oh, they're just pretending. They're just being manipulative. And this suspicion is deepened, especially in the early stages of dementia, when it's not all or nothing. So some days their short-term memory's working, some days it's not. Some days they can remember things that they can't remember other days. And so this makes people deeply suspicious that they're just pretending and they're just not trying hard enough. So this inconsistency and unreliability of memory is very trying for people both with dementia and for the people looking after them. Now, progressive retrograde amnesia is the memory loss that's the pattern that's very typical for people with Alzheimer's disease. If you have someone, for example, with vascular dementia, they may maintain their short-term memory longer. Their long-term memory is patchy, so rather than going back through time, like the Alzheimer's disease, you might have whole decades missing or whole aspects of their life that they're not able to do. With frontal lobe dementia, there is no memory loss at the beginning. The major change with frontal lobe is difficulty in making decisions, and this has a whole different set of challenges for the families. With Lewy body dementia, or oftentimes people have more than one type of dementia. It's fairly common for people to have vascular dementia and Alzheimer's disease. You're going to get a variable pattern. And so it's important to look at that individual, what is their pattern of memory loss, and to flow their care through based on that. As time passes, all the diseases affect more and more of the brain, and so their symptoms and their needs become similar. They experience changes in their context. They're living in the present, but with the long-term memory loss, they're misinterpreting the context of the present. So, for example, there was a fellow in a nursing home. He kept his language ability longer than most people with Alzheimer's. And he said to his wife, you know, it's very hard being 14 years old and living in this prison with all these old people. So from that, I mean, not everybody is as verbal as he was able to be. And from people like that, we get a real window into what it is to experience Alzheimer's disease. So looking for clues about what context they think they're in and going from there to try to meet their needs. This fellow is obviously feeling shut in and he's feeling trapped. And so looking for things that are going to occupy him and decrease the amount of time he's feeling that way it's very important. Thoughtful care uses emotional palliation as its guiding principle. So it's very helpful to people who are experiencing dementia if people try this approach of emotional palliation. We can't change his mind about what's true. We can't say to him, you're not 14, you're not in a prison. You know, you're in a nursing home because you need help. That information is not going to be kept and he won't be able to use it. But we can decrease his suffering by shortening the time that he's experiencing these painful emotions that he's obviously having. He's experiencing abandonment, he's experiencing injustice, and he's experiencing frustration due to his confinement. So that's the important place to focus. The memory process of the immediate or working memory is another one I'd like to talk about the experience of. Excuse me. This lasts for all of us, about the length of a short conversation. And this type of immediate or working memory is preserved for a fair length of time with Alzheimer's disease. So when you converse briefly with a person with Alzheimer's disease, they can make perfect sense and they have a perfectly good conversation, especially in the early stages of Alzheimer's disease. But then other people will say, well, there's nothing the matter with you. You don't have Alzheimer's disease. And that doubt is very difficult to hear for people who are struggling with the symptoms of dementia. It also may lead to delayed recognition that dementia is present by health personnel, although I've seen huge improvements in the last 10 or 12 years in early diagnosis. If you add this ability to converse with a couple of other things, we have lifelong habits of being socially appropriate. You know, so if, for example, if somebody calls you and says, hi, it's me, you're going to say, well, how are you today? I hope I can figure out from the context here who on earth this is. So we try to be socially appropriate, and we also try to hide our memory lapses. So somebody's talking to us about something they recently experienced. We're madly trying to remember what it was that they told us. So we all have these habits of being socially appropriate, of hiding our memory lapses, and people with dementia still have these. These are lifelong habits, and so it makes it even more tempting for somebody to say, oh, you don't really have Alzheimer's disease. So people who don't want to accept that the person has dementia are able to convince themselves that there's nothing wrong with this person, that the person is really normal. For example, there was one fellow with dementia, his brother phoned him. And his brother spent the whole conversation telling him everything that was going on in his own life. And the fellow with dementia said, oh, really? Oh, isn't that great, you know? Being socially appropriate. And then, in all the right places. And then the brother got on the phone with his sister-in-law and he said, see, I told you. He understood every single thing that I said. But 5 minutes after that conversation, the fellow did not remember that his brother had called at all. And so you can see it's the failure to understand and support the household where one person has dementia makes it very, very difficult for the caregivers, the carers, and adds to the suffering caused by the disease, both to the carers and the people with dementia. You know, it would be very unusual for anybody to lie about having been diagnosed with dementia. And yet, every person that I've talked to who has been diagnosed with dementia has had this experience, has had people routinely say to them, oh, there's nothing the matter with you, you don't have dementia. And this really does increase the difficulty in their life. I'm not sure why we do this. This is very, very common. I mean, we wouldn't say that to somebody who said, I have cancer or I have kidney disease, but for some reason we do when people say that they have dementia. There is a lot of stigma around dementia, of course, and this is perhaps one of the reasons why, but I think it's very important to be thoughtful about that. So if somebody says, I have dementia, not saying, oh, you look fine to me, or, well, everybody has memory problems, I have memory problems. Instead, saying something like, oh, I'm so sorry to hear that. How's it going anyway? I think that's a much more supportive attitude to take. So, other changes that determine the experience of having dementia. People may form new memories, new long-term memories, if the event is emotional. So emotional mediation is another way to lay down a long-term memory that does not rely on short-term memory. So, it's the difference between learning for the first time how to use a GPS. I don't know about you guys, I still haven't mastered it. I'm trying with my short-term memory, but it's not there. You would use a short-term memory to familiarize yourself with the steps and the understanding. The difference between that and learning that you've won a car. You don't have to follow the instructions there. You don't have to try to memorize it. You know right away you've won a car. It's very emotional. And so we remember it automatically. And people with Alzheimer's disease will still make new long-term memories that have an emotional content for them for a few years after the onset of Alzheimer's. And so they might, when people remember one thing from their present but forget almost everything else that's current, other people think that they're pretending, and they cajole them and they scold them and say, come on, you can remember this if you really try. Now, we don't have any kind of control over what people are going to remember. I remember one lady telling me about taking her mother to her great-granddaughter's birthday party, and she was so hoping that her mother would remember her great-granddaughter and her birthday party. And the next day, her mom remembered that somebody gave her a bag of candy, and she was thrilled. So, I mean, we don't have any control over what people are going to remember, but they do make those memories. And so understanding that that happens is very important to the understanding of the changes that take place in dementia. People with dementia also may slowly form new long-term memories of procedures. So procedural learning, people who have access to this memory will learn something they do over and over again. This is like learning how to ride a bike, learning how to tie your shoes when you're a child. There is physical movement along with the memory, so that's kind of what's involved in a procedural memory. You're physically moving while you're making the memory. People with dementia will learn something, and it'll be in their long-term memory eventually if they do it repeatedly over many weeks or many months. And as an example, there's a whole program to help people with dementia use and access their procedural memory. It's called Spaced Retrieval, and Cameron Camp was the fellow who spearheaded this research. It's online, available at myersresearch.com. So with dementia, procedures are learned very slowly. If you think of yourself, for example, you go to a hotel you've never been to. It might take you a little while to learn where the room is. You might make a couple of mistakes. But once you've been there once, you have your short-term memory to help you out, and you go directly there the second, third time, and fourth time. Contrast that to a person with dementia who goes into a nursing home. It might take them a few weeks or a few months. So when they first come in, somebody has to come along, take them down to the dining room, take them back to their room. And then all of a sudden, one day, they go by themselves. because they've learned that procedure, and they have it now. But think about what happens if you move them to a different room. They're going to go back to the room that took them 3 months to learn how to get to. So it's very important when making decisions like that. If you have somebody who's walking back and forth and they know where their room is, that's a really good reason to keep them there. Because it's very unnerving, of course, for the new person to have somebody else coming into their room all the time, and unnerving for them to always be told that they're making a mistake. People with dementia also experience having obsessions. From talking to many, many families and people with dementia, I've developed the understanding that this often results from trying to remember something. So if they have a doctor's appointment coming up in 3 weeks, that person may ask about it several times a day for fear of letting go of that information. They may have received the information, they may have received reassurance about whatever it is they're obsessing about, but they're not able to remember that either what was said to them or that they did receive any reassurance. It's in their mind that they're worried about this doctor's appointment. So they're unable to learn the issue that the issue has been resolved because of the short-term memory loss. One example was a lady who was really obsessed about where her husband was working. He worked out of town. She was in her early 50s when she developed dementia. But before she developed dementia, and it had always been important to her to know which town he was working in, because it was usually a different one every day. And he was a bit driven to distraction by her constantly asking in the morning, "Where are you working today?" Without even a pause of 2 seconds, "Where are you working today?" So we helped him. He put up a whiteboard, and he wrote down the name of the town that he was working in. And every time she said, "Where are you working today?" they walked to the whiteboard. And so she was able to then learn, whenever she thought, "I wonder where he is today," she could walk to the whiteboard. And but it was interesting, I saw him later, and I said, "Well, how did that go?" And he says, "Oh, it didn't work." And I said, "Oh, why is that?" "Well, she just kept going to the whiteboard all the time." He was thinking that, and then she would say, "Oh, I see you're working in Cambridge today. Oh, I see you're working in Cambridge today." His hope for that whiteboard had been that it would improve her memory. My hope was that it would keep her reassured and calm. And so I said, "Well, what did you do?" And he said, "Oh, I stopped writing it on." And I said, "Oh, what was her response to that?" And he just looked at me and he said, "She wrote it on herself." So you can see that she did develop that procedural memory and knew that she would get an answer if she walked to that whiteboard. People often obsess about money, and I find this really understandable. I mean, how would you feel right now if you didn't know how to access your money? You didn't know how much you had, you didn't know what bank it was in, and now imagine your anxiety continuing to build the longer you don't know this, and everybody tells you to stop worrying about it and not talk about it. You can see that that would be something that I find that extremely understandable, that people would obsess about their money. They may not understand or remember that they have a dementia. And so many people experience a loss of insight. Our brain lets us evaluate how we're doing. And if this area, if our ability to have insight is already affected by dementia, they're unable to recognize that they have an illness. This is not a willful denial. This is not saying, "Oh, no, I'm fine," even though they know they're not. This is just being unable to do it. So when insight is lacking, though, people with Alzheimer's or dementia still have a feeling that their world is altered. An example is one lady who was taken to the airport by her children, and before this, they had told her about 16 times a day, "Mom, you're going on a trip, so-and-so's going with you, this is where you're going, this is who you're going to see." And she got to the airport and she said, "Do you think I'm a child that you can't tell me what's going on?" So even though she had no insight into the fact that she had dementia, to her, her world was altered because people were treating her differently and treating her badly. And this becomes, nobody ever tells me what's going on. And so, you know, people show up unexpectedly and they don't remember they're coming, they get agitated, they get perplexed. They still trust their memory, like many people with dementia, of course, like everybody else, they trust their memory. When people have insight, this often leads to depression. So for an example, one fellow with no insight went jogging down the road in the middle of a highway. And as soon as he went outside, he could see the road, he started to run, and the family had a very difficult time getting him back and stopping him from running. What they had to do was put up a fence all the way across the front of the yard, and then whenever he went outside, he didn't see the road, he didn't think about running, and that's how they had to deal with that. Another example of someone with insight was a lady who lived with her daughter, and she would go for a walk that way, and she would go for a walk that way, but never let herself lose track of where her daughter's house was because she knew she would get lost. So people with insight and without insight, they have very different needs. And so it's very thoughtful to ask yourself, okay, how does having or not having some insight change their care? They may not be able to know that there's anything wrong. What do I have to do differently here? People with dementia also experience a dissociation with time. They're unable to tell time, unable to remember what day it is, what month it is, what year it is, and also associating the things that go along with time. If it's December, we're going to need warm clothes, otherwise we're going to get cold outside. All of those connections are broken. If it's dark outside, if the clock says it's 3 in the morning, it's not the time to make a phone call. All of those connections are broken. So when you have the short-term memory loss, the long-term memory loss involved, as well as the dissociation with time, it's like a time machine going out of control for these people. It's a very, very difficult experience. So it's very important to establish an attitude of patience, that they can come to you when they're feeling overwhelmed and know that they'll always be treated with kindness and with respect. If they're consistently treated well, this actually becomes a habit. It becomes a procedural memory for them, that they know when they're feeling overwhelmed, they can come and seek you out. People with dementia may experience being unable to initiate any organized activity. So this isn't a willful apathy of just, I can't be bothered doing anything, but it looks like that. It looks like they're being lazy. They might just sit in a chair, but they're actually not able to get up and to start planning and executing the kinds of things, all the steps that need to be done in order to make something happen. But they may well enjoy activities that other people plan for them. Yitka Zgola, in her book Care That Works, carefully described the levels of engagement, you know, from being able to fully plan and execute a project to just not being able to plan but help with the steps of the project, and then maybe not do quite as much, just do a little bit, and then finally the lowest level of engagement is just watching somebody else do something, but it's still being engaged. And so when people are not able to initiate organized activity, it means that they've lost the ability to entertain themselves. One fellow said to me, you know, with this Alzheimer's, life is so boring. And that's exactly how he experienced it, because he couldn't do anything. Another fellow, he was sitting alone in the dark corner of the living room in a chair. That's how he was spending his time. And he started on Aricept, and he was what they call a super responder. He did amazingly well after he first started on it. And he said, oh, at least I can do something again. I can make myself a sandwich. I can take the bus. And so he was very, very pleased with that. He was actually a master chef before he developed Alzheimer's. And so it can make a huge difference. So another pattern that people experience is to have frequent activity that they feel is purposeful, but they're not actually accomplishing anything. So they might be moving furniture around, and they may be trying to put things back the way they remember them, the way they should be, but they're constantly doing this. Or they might be vacuuming and vacuum one tiny little corner of the living room. I knew a lady who did that half her day, and she felt that she was doing the whole house. So this inability to do organized activity is another thing that's experienced. But they need, oftentimes, people still need to be busy. They need to feel like they have a sense of purpose, and so it's important to let them carry on and do that. People with dementia also experience a slowness in thinking, in acting, and in talking. So they're unable to hurry. They become very agitated when they're rushed. One lady was describing to me how her husband would take about an hour before he developed dementia to get up in the morning, have breakfast, have a shower, get dressed, shave, be ready to go out the door. Before he went in the nursing home, the same activities took him over 4 hours with her helping him all the way. So it's very, very slow. People move very slowly. People with dementia also experience a loss of their language, so their receptive language, being able to understand what other people are saying to them. Right now, there's a string of sounds coming out of my mouth, and you're able to take those sounds and put them together into syllables and words and attach the meaning to each and every word, and then integrate everything into understanding the thought. And at the same time, you're multitasking. You're thinking about other things that you already know about dementia, or other people that you know about dementia. And so that's what our normal receptive language is about. When someone doesn't have their receptive language anymore, it's when they hear somebody speak in their mother tongue, it's like hearing a foreign language. It makes no sense. They don't understand where the words begin and end. They don't understand what's being said at all. As well, all expressive language, their ability to put their thoughts into words, is eventually lost. And so this often starts with a word-finding difficulty. Because of the progressive retrograde amnesia, people will lose their second language or their third language first. So the language that they learned later on in life, they lose first. So with word-finding difficulty, it's always important to thoughtfully ascertain whether or not the person wants any help with it. So many people with dementia talked about, how people jump in and give them the word that they think they want. And this can be difficult for the person with dementia if it's not the right word, especially because then they're distracted, they can't remember what they're saying at all. And so, we used to ask people, would you like us to help you out? And some people say yes, and some people say no. And some people say, let me think about it for a little while before you jump in and help. And so that's very thoughtful to always try to give control. These are people that are losing control on almost everything in their life. And so every little bit of control you can give back to them is extremely important. It's also important to be aware that when people are losing their expressive and receptive language abilities, that they're using your body language as communication. And be aware. Most of us are unaware completely of what our body language is saying to other people. And so first of all, becoming aware of it's very important. And then becoming aware of how it's being interpreted. And then eventually using your body language intentionally to communicate with the person with dementia and to let them know that you're a friend of theirs and that you mean them no harm and that you're there for a positive reason. So, think about coming up to somebody with dementia. Now, somebody just cut you off in traffic, so you're like this. Are they going to like that better than this? No, they're going to respond well to somebody with warmth in their face who's concentrating on them and has a very pleasant message from their body language. And that can make an enormous difference in approaching someone. People also experience progressive geographic disorientation. So now if you go from your house to the grocery store, for example, there are probably many different routes that you can travel and you can choose. You've got the map in your head of all the different places all the different ways you can get there and home again. And this is the map that people with dementia lose. They no longer have that orientation. It starts with when they're out of town, they go there less frequently, and so they're more likely to get lost when they're out of town. And I'm sure all of you have heard stories about that happening to people and ending up hundreds of miles away. And then their world gets smaller. Then they get lost within their own town. Then they get lost within their own neighborhood. Then they get lost eventually within their own home. They can't geographically orient themselves to their home. So for example, one fellow, he went to his daughter's every night for supper. And he could still drive, and he would show up without fail, and then one night he just didn't come. And his daughter became worried, and she went over to see what was the matter. And on her way, she saw there was a detour. And he said to her, I couldn't get there because the street was blocked off. So he knew how to get there if he followed the same procedure, but trying to map out a different route, he no longer was capable of doing that. He didn't have that executive ability to adapt to change. Another fellow went outside in his sock feet and his shirt sleeves, 3 feet of snow on the backyard, and his wife said to him, where are you going, Larry? I loved Larry. Where are you going, Larry? And he said, I'm just going to the bathroom. So you can see that someone who no longer is oriented to the geography of their own home is far too vulnerable to be left alone. This is something that's very important. People experience a loss of executive functioning. So executive functioning is a complicated task with many different steps that and many different skills are required. So it relies on short-term memory to sequence the steps and to know whether or not you've already done them, long-term memory to maintain the skills, and both to plan the function and also to evaluate whether or not you did it well. So making a meal, for example, driving a car, all of these things require many memories, many different skills, many different judgments to be made almost simultaneously, and a short-term memory to remember what's been done already and what comes next. So the family are often intolerant of people who fail to do their usual activities. I remember one fellow saying to me, you know, she says she's bored all the time. Well, why doesn't she just knit? She always used to knit. Well, of course, she'd lost the ability to knit. Where's my knitting? Am I at the front or the back? What row did I do last? It's gone. And so, you know, there's someone being very intolerant. Well, she wants me to help her, wants me to entertain her and help her know what to do next all the time. But why doesn't she just do that herself? So it's very thoughtful to understand. It's very thoughtful to help people accept help. Sometimes it's very difficult for people with dementia to accept help with what they're doing. And to understand their feelings of not wanting to give up their independence. I remember one lady, it was her job to make the cake in the family whenever anybody in the family had a birthday. Well, one cake turned out very badly, and so the family said, well, we better get somebody else to make the cake. But instead, you know, I encouraged them, and they sent one person over at each time the cake was to be made, and said, can you show me how to make a cake, Grandma? You know, and that worked really, really well. So allowing her to maintain her skills and her role in the family. Eventually, people lose all these executive functions that are needed to organize their lives, using the telephone, shopping, food preparation, hobbies, financial management. Other people need to do these things for them. The negotiation is a very fine balancing act, helping them stay independent as long as possible, helping them negotiate, giving up some of their responsibilities, helping them to stay safe and still get done what needs to be done. People experience being unable to continue working or to continue roles within their community as well. So if someone is still working when they develop dementia, they're unable to sequence what it is they're supposed to do at work. They're unable to learn new procedures, how to use new equipment. Very often, they end up losing their job, and then a couple of years down the road, they're diagnosed with dementia that nobody realized was there. So, also, for example, a family role of childcare. It's very difficult for someone with dementia to maintain the ability to care for children. Are they looking after them or not? Are they in the store with them or not? They're so huge changes in roles in terms of family and working life. It's very important for families and others to recognize that they're not keeping two things in their mind at the same time. And this has implications for your relationships. They may never thank you for what you're doing. They have, because of their lack of insight, they may not appreciate what it is you're doing for them. They're desperate, they're going through their day desperately trying to put one foot in front of the other and keep track of what's happening in their day and what are they supposed to do next and where are they supposed to be and who's with them. And they end up appearing to be self-centered because they're concentrating on what they're supposed to do so much that they're not able to show the appreciation to other people. And so the carers are working very, very hard, harder than they've ever worked in their lives, and not being said thank you to. So it's very important to understand this. These are in the early days too, what carers are going through. With a couple, the person who has dementia and the other, their carer, are negotiating who's going to take over the roles. With the current cohort that's elderly now, the husband may never have cooked in his life. The wife may never have trimmed the hedge or done the finances. And they're trying desperately to look after the person with dementia, to take over their roles. And usually the person with dementia is standing there saying, "You're not doing that right." You know, that happens. I remember one fellow, he complained that his wife would stand beside the washing machine and say that to him. And I said, well, if it was you with the dementia and she was out trimming the hedge, what would she be doing? What would you be doing? He said, you have a point. So gradually, over many years, people with dementia lose their ability to care for themselves because of their loss of memory, but also because of their neuromuscular control loss. So the dementia affects their motor control, it affects their coordination, and they experience a decrease in their dexterity as well. Their balance is decreased, and the person is in danger of falling. So their gait changes, their steps become shorter, and eventually they're shuffling, and eventually they're not able to walk. All of these things are part of dementia. They have an inability to direct their body movements, and this starts fairly early, having decreased coordination, so not being able to do up buttons and zippers, and an inability to sequence activity. They may be inaccurate in even knowing where their limbs are. For example, I've got my arm up in the air. I know my arm's up in the air because I have a sense called proprioception, and we all do. And there are receptors, baroreceptors in our arms that are giving our brain the information about where our limbs are. So when the brain is not receiving and interpreting this information correctly, you have the phenomenon of people who have their legs over the side of the bed, but they're telling you, no, my legs are in bed. You know, they just don't understand. So they become progressively more and more dependent and able to do less and less for themselves, and then other people need to step in. So if I'm looking at my watch, it's about 3 minutes to lunch. Lee's very pleased with me for remembering that. So I hope you all have a lovely lunch, and I'll finish up afterwards. Thanks.
Every time I hear